The afternoon sun was beating down on the quiet suburban streets of Oakwood Hills when 16-year-old Tyler Johnson carefully backed his mother's silver Honda out of their driveway. He checked his mirrors twice, adjusted his seat, and made sure his seatbelt was secure. His mother had only recently started letting him drive alone, and he wasn't about to mess up this privilege. Tyler glanced at his phone sitting in the cup holder. The screen showed a text from his little sister Zoe. "Don't forget to pick me up. Soccer practice ends at 4:30. He smiled and shook his head, as if he could forget. Zoe had reminded him about 6 times that morning, and their mom had written it on a sticky note that was still attached to his backpack. The drive to Zoe's school would normally take about 15 minutes, but Tyler always left 25 minutes early. He had learned from his father that being punctual was one of the most important habits a person could develop. His dad had drilled this into him since he was young, though Tyler hadn't seen much of his father lately due to his demanding work schedule. As Tyler drove through the upscale neighborhood that served as a shortcut to his sister's school, he couldn't help but notice how different this area looked from his own neighborhood. The houses here were massive, with perfectly manicured lawns and expensive cars parked in circular driveways. Tyler's family lived in a nice middle-class area, but nothing like this. His mother worked as a nurse at the regional medical center, often pulling double shifts to make sure Tyler and Zoe had everything they needed. Tyler was listening to music and thinking about his upcoming chemistry test when he noticed the police car in his rearview mirror. The officer had been following him for about 3 blocks now, maintaining the same distance. Tyler's heart rate picked up slightly, but he told himself there was nothing to worry about. He was driving exactly the speed limit, had used his turn signals, and hadn't done anything wrong. But then the red and blue lights started flashing. Tyler's stomach dropped. He had never been pulled over before, and suddenly all the conversations his parents had with him about interacting with police came flooding back. "Keep your hands visible," his mother had said. "Be polite and respectful," his father had added. "Don't make any sudden movements." Tyler carefully pulled over to the curb, making sure to use his turn signal. He turned off the radio, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure the officer would be able to hear it. Officer Jake Morrison stepped out of his patrol car with a swagger that suggested he owned the entire neighborhood. He was a stocky man in his early 40s with a permanent scowl etched into his face. Morrison had been patrolling this area for over 10 years, and he had very specific ideas about who belonged here and who didn't. As Morrison approached the Honda, his hand rested casually on his service weapon. He had already made up his mind about this traffic stop before he even reached the window. A young black kid driving a nice car through Oakwood Hills? In Morrison's experience, that usually meant one thing: trouble. "License and registration," Morrison barked without any greeting or explanation for the stop. Tyler's voice came out smaller than he intended. "Yes, sir. May I ask why you pulled me over?" Morrison's eyes narrowed. "I'll ask the questions here. License and registration. Now." Tyler slowly reached for the glove compartment, announcing his movements as his parents had taught him. "I'm reaching for the registration in the glove box, sir." His hands were shaking slightly as he retrieved the documents. Then he carefully pulled his wallet from his back pocket and handed over his license. Morrison examined the documents with exaggerated suspicion, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. Tyler's license was clearly legitimate, showing his correct name, address, and photo. The registration showed that the car belonged to Linda Johnson, with an address that matched Tyler's license. "This your car?" Morrison asked, even though the registration clearly showed otherwise. "No, sir, it belongs to my mother. I'm Tyler Johnson, and that's my mom's name on the registration." "Linda Johnson." "Where are you going?" "To pick up my sister from soccer practice at Westfield Elementary." Morrison walked around the car slowly, peering into the windows and checking the license plate against his computer. Everything came back clean, just as Tyler knew it would. But Morrison wasn't satisfied. He returned to the driver's window with an even more aggressive demeanor. "Step out of the vehicle." Tyler's blood ran cold. "Sir, may I ask why?" "I don't think I've done anything wrong." "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Tyler's mind raced. His parents had prepared him for this moment, but experiencing it was completely different from discussing it at the dinner table. He knew he had to comply, but every instinct told him this was escalating beyond anything reasonable. "Yes, sir," Tyler said quietly, slowly opening his door and stepping out with his hands visible. Morrison immediately began a confrontational line of questioning. "What are you really doing in this neighborhood? You dealing drugs? Got any weapons in the car?" "No, sir, I'm just going to pick up my sister. I can show you the text message if you'd like." "Don't move," Morrison snapped. "Where did you get this car? How do I know you didn't steal it?" Tyler felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. "Sir, the registration shows it belongs to my mother. My license matches the address. I can call her if you need verification." But Morrison had already made up his mind. He grabbed Tyler's arm roughly and spun him around, pushing him against the car. "You're under arrest for possession of a stolen vehicle." "What, sir? This isn't stolen. Please, just call my mother. She works at Regional Medical Center. She can verify everything." Tyler's protests fell on deaf ears as Morrison roughly handcuffed him behind his back. The metal cuffs bit into Tyler's wrists as Morrison tightened them more than necessary. Several neighbors had come out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. A few were recording with their phones from their porches and driveways. "Hey!" shouted Mrs. Patterson from across the street. "That boy wasn't doing anything wrong. I saw the whole thing." Morrison whirled around and pointed at her aggressively. "Ma'am, I need you to stop interfering with police business and go back inside your house. Anyone else who continues recording will be arrested for obstruction of justice." The threat worked. Most of the neighbors reluctantly went back inside, though a few continued watching from their windows. Mrs. Patterson hesitated but ultimately went back into her house when Morrison took a step toward her property. Tyler found himself sitting in the back of a police car for the first time in his life, his hands cuffed behind him, and his mind reeling from how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Through the window, he could see Morrison searching his mother's car, tossing items around carelessly. 20 minutes later, Tyler's phone was buzzing frantically in the cup holder where he had left it. Zoe was probably wondering where he was. Soccer practice would be ending soon, and she would be looking for the familiar silver Honda that never came. As Morrison finished his search and found nothing incriminating, he slammed the car door and walked back to his patrol vehicle with a satisfied expression. In his mind, he had done his job. He had removed what he saw as a threat from a neighborhood where it didn't belong. But Tyler wasn't a threat. He was an honor student who had never been in trouble with the law. He was a big brother who took his responsibilities seriously and a son who respected his parents' teachings. And now he was about to enter a nightmare that would test everything his family stood for. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a confused neighborhood and a little girl waiting at soccer practice, who was about to learn that her brother wouldn't be coming to pick her up after all. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Morrison led Tyler through a maze of hallways toward the booking area. Tyler's mind was still spinning from everything that had happened. Just an hour ago, he had been a regular teenager driving to pick up his sister. Now he was handcuffed and being processed like a criminal. "Name," the desk sergeant said without looking up from his paperwork. "Tyler Johnson," Tyler replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrison leaned against the counter with a satisfied smirk. "Book him for grand theft auto, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct." Tyler's head snapped up. "Resisting arrest? Sir, I never resisted. I did everything you asked me to do." The desk sergeant, a tired-looking man named Officer Rodriguez, glanced between Tyler and Morrison with a puzzled expression. He had seen plenty of arrests come through this station, and something about this one didn't feel right. The kid looked terrified, not defiant. His clothes were clean, his speech was polite, and he didn't fit the profile of someone who would steal a car in broad daylight. "Morrison, you got the paperwork for the stolen vehicle report?" Rodriguez asked. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Still, working on that. The car's registered to some woman named Linda Johnson, probably a fake name or stolen identity." "Did you run it through the system?" "Of course I did," Morrison lied smoothly. "It came back as suspicious. Look, Rodriguez, I've been doing this for 10 years. I know a car thief when I see one. Rodriguez wasn't entirely convinced, but he had learned long ago not to question his colleagues too openly. The department had an unspoken rule about backing each other up, even when things seemed off. He processed Tyler's booking with growing unease. Meanwhile, across town at Westfield Elementary, 10-year-old Zoe Johnson stood outside the school with her soccer bag, scanning the pickup line for her mother's silver Honda. Coach Williams had dismissed practice 15 minutes ago, and most of her teammates had already been picked up, so he checked the plastic watch on her wrist for the 5th time. Tyler was never late. "Zoe, honey, is someone coming to get you?" Coach Williams asked, walking over with concern in her voice. "My brother should be here by now," Zoe said, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "He's always on time. Maybe there's traffic?" Coach Williams pulled out her phone. "Let's call your mom just to be safe." At Regional Medical Center, Linda Johnson was in the middle of checking on a patient when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, knowing how busy her shift was, but something made her glance at the caller ID. When she saw it was from Zoe's school, her heart skipped a beat. "Hello? Mrs. Johnson? This is Coach Williams from Westfield Elementary. Zoe is still here, waiting to be picked up. Is everything okay?" Linda's blood ran cold. Tyler had never missed a pickup. Never. "I'll be right there," she said, already heading for the door. "Please stay with her." 20 minutes later, Linda arrived at the school with panic written across her face. Zoe ran to her mother, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Mom, where's Tyler? He promised he'd pick me up." Linda hugged her daughter tightly, her mind racing through possibilities. Car trouble? An accident? She tried calling Tyler's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like him either. Tyler always kept his phone charged and answered when family called. Back at the police station, Tyler sat alone in a holding cell, still wearing his school clothes and trying to process what had happened to him. The cell was small and cold, with concrete walls and a metal bench that served as both seat and bed. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something Tyler didn't want to identify. Other prisoners had come and gone during Tyler's first few hours there. Most were adults who had been arrested for various minor offenses. They looked at Tyler with curiosity, wondering what such a young, clean-cut kid was doing in a place like this. "First time?" asked an older man in the cell across from Tyler's. Tyler nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "What they get you for?" "They said I stole a car, but I didn't. It's my mom's car." The man shook his head sadly. "That's rough, kid. Some of these cops, they get an idea in their head and won't let it go, even when the facts don't add up." Officer Danny Walsh was Morrison's partner, and he had been feeling increasingly uncomfortable since they returned to the station. Walsh was relatively new to the force, having joined just 2 years ago with genuine intentions of serving his community. He had partnered with Morrison because the senior officer was supposed to be showing him the ropes. But what Walsh had witnessed today didn't align with anything he had learned in the police academy. The kid had been cooperative, polite, and clearly frightened. His story about picking up his sister had been consistent, and the registration documents seemed legitimate. Walsh had run the license plate himself after Morrison claimed it was suspicious, and everything came back clean. "Morrison," Walsh said quietly as they sat at their desks completing paperwork. "Are you sure about this arrest? The kid's story checks out, and I didn't see any signs of him resisting." Morrison looked up sharply. "You questioning my judgment, rookie?" "No, sir. I just want to make sure we've got everything right. His mother's probably worried sick." "His mother?" Morrison laughed harshly. If she cared about her kid, she wouldn't let him run around stealing cars. Walsh felt his stomach turn, but the car wasn't stolen. The registration matched his license address. Morrison's expression darkened. "Listen carefully, Walsh. That punk was up to no good in a neighborhood where he didn't belong. Maybe he hadn't stolen that specific car yet, but he was casing houses. I've seen it 100 times. We prevented a crime today. But we can't arrest someone for a crime they haven't committed. We arrested him for the crimes he did commit. Disorderly conduct when he started arguing with me. Resisting arrest when he questioned my authority. And I'm still investigating the stolen vehicle angle." Walsh knew that none of that was true, but he also knew that speaking up further could end his career before it really started. The police department had a code, and breaking that code had consequences. By evening, Linda Johnson had called every hospital, every police station, and every friend Tyler might have visited. Her calls to the main police station were met with standard responses. We can't give out information about ongoing investigations, and if you believe your son is missing, you can file a missing person report. It wasn't until she mentioned Tyler's full name for the third time that the desk officer finally made the connection. "Ma'am, did you say Tyler Johnson?" "Yes. He's 16. He was driving my silver Honda to pick up his daughter from school." There was a long pause. "Ma'am, I think you need to come down to the station, bring identification and proof that the Honda belongs to you." Linda's world tilted. "Is my son there? Is he okay?" "Ma'am, please just come to the station. We'll explain everything when you get here." The drive to the police station was the longest 20 minutes of Linda's life. She had called her sister to watch Zoe, and now she was racing through traffic, with her mind conjuring up worst-case scenarios. When she finally arrived at the station, she clutched Tyler's birth certificate, the car registration, insurance papers, and every other document she could think of. "I'm Linda Johnson," she told the desk sergeant, her voice shaking. "I think you have my son, Tyler." Officer Rodriguez looked up at her with genuine sympathy. "Ma'am, your son was arrested this afternoon on suspicion of auto theft." "Auto theft? Of my own car? I understand this is confusing, ma'am. Officer Morrison is the arresting officer, but he's off duty now. You'll need to speak with a supervisor." Linda waited for what felt like hours before Sergeant Thompson finally came out to speak with her. She spread Tyler's documents across the desk, proving beyond any doubt that Tyler was her son and the car was legally hers. "Sergeant, there's obviously been a mistake. This is my car, Tyler is my son, and he was doing exactly what he told your officer he was doing." Sergeant Thompson reviewed the documents with growing concern. The case against Tyler was falling apart before his eyes, but Morrison had already filed the charges. Releasing Tyler now would mean admitting that a significant error had been made. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand your concern. Your son will have a hearing tomorrow morning where this can all be sorted out." "Tomorrow morning? He has to spend the night here?" "I'm afraid so, ma'am. Once charges are filed, we have to follow procedure." Linda felt like screaming. Her son, who had never even had a detention at school, was spending the night in jail because an officer had made assumptions and refused to admit his mistake. As she drove home to explain to Zoe why her brother wouldn't be coming home that night, Linda made a decision. She was going to call the one person she knew who could help them navigate this nightmare, a lawyer named Christine Rodriguez, who had helped their family with legal paperwork in the past. What Linda didn't know was that the situation was about to become much more complicated, and what she definitely didn't know was that Tyler's father, who had been unreachable for weeks due to his undercover assignment, was about to find out what had happened to his son. That discovery would change everything. The courthouse was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning. Tyler sat in the defendant's chair wearing his best khakis and a button-down shirt that his mother had ironed twice the night before. His hands were folded in his lap, and he kept glancing at the gallery where his mother sat in the front row, her face a mixture of determination and barely controlled anger. Tyler had spent one of the worst nights of his life in juvenile detention. The facility was cold, noisy, and filled with kids who seemed much tougher than him. He had barely slept, partly because of the uncomfortable mattress and partly because his mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed the traffic stop, wondering what he could have done differently. Attorney Christine Rodriguez sat next to Tyler, organizing her files with methodical precision. She was a small woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an impressive track record of defending clients against questionable police procedures. When Linda had called her the night before, Christine had immediately recognized the case as problematic. "Tyler," Christine whispered, "remember what we discussed. Answer clearly, speak loudly enough for the judge to hear, and don't let anyone intimidate you. You did nothing wrong." Tyler nodded, though his stomach was churning with anxiety. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, A stern-faced man named Bill Crawford was reviewing his notes. Crawford had been working with the police department for over 15 years and rarely questioned the charges brought by officers, especially experienced ones like Morrison. Judge Patricia Williams called the court to order. She was known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for wasted time. We're here for the preliminary hearing in the case of the state versus Tyler Johnson. Counselor Crawford, present your case. Crawford stood up confidently. Your Honor, the defendant was arrested yesterday afternoon by Officer Morrison for grand theft auto, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. Officer Morrison observed the defendant driving suspiciously through an upscale neighborhood and discovered he was in possession of a stolen vehicle. Christine immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is mischaracterizing the evidence. The vehicle in question belongs to the defendant's mother, as clearly shown by the registration documents. Judge Williams looked at Crawford with raised eyebrows. Counselor, do you have evidence that the vehicle was actually stolen? Crawford hesitated for just a moment. Your Honor, Officer Morrison will testify that his investigation revealed suspicious circumstances surrounding the defendant's possession of the vehicle. Call your first witness, the judge said, though her tone suggested she was already skeptical. Officer Morrison walked to the witness stand with his characteristic swagger. He had put on his dress uniform for the occasion and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had testified in court dozens of times. Morrison had spent the morning rehearsing his story, adding details that would make Tyler seem more threatening and his own actions more justified. Officer Morrison, Crawford began, please tell the court what happened on the afternoon in question. Morrison settled into his testimony like he was telling a story he had practiced many times. Your Honor, I was patrolling the Oakwood Hills neighborhood when I observed the defendant driving erratically and at excessive speeds through a residential area known for break-ins and theft. Tyler's eyes widened. He had been driving exactly the speed limit and had been extremely careful with his turns and stops. His mother gripped the armrest of her seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. I initiated a traffic stop, Morrison continued, and immediately noticed the defendant's nervous and evasive behavior. When I requested his license and registration, he became argumentative and refused to cooperate. Christine was taking notes furiously. Every word Morrison spoke was contradicting what Tyler had told her, and she was preparing to demolish his testimony. The defendant claimed the vehicle belonged to his mother, Morrison said with a dismissive tone, but could not provide adequate proof of this claim. When I attempted to place him under arrest for further investigation, he physically resisted and became verbally abusive. Crawford nodded approvingly. Officer Morrison, in your professional opinion, was the defendant's behavior consistent with someone involved in criminal activity? Absolutely. I've been a police officer for 10 years and I've seen this pattern many times. Young males driving expensive vehicles in neighborhoods where they don't belong, usually up to no good. Christine stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating and making assumptions based on irrelevant factors. Sustained, Judge Williams said sharply. Officer Morrison, please stick to facts, not opinions about who belongs where. Crawford finished his direct examination, and Christine approached the witness stand for cross-examination. She had spent years dismantling police testimony that didn't align with evidence, and Morrison was about to discover that his version of events had serious problems. Officer Morrison, you testified that my client was driving erratically. Did you use a radar gun to measure his speed? No, but I could tell he was speeding. How fast would you estimate he was going? Morrison hesitated. Approximately 45 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour zone. Christine pulled out a document. Officer Morrison, according to your own police report, you wrote that the defendant was traveling at approximately the posted speed limit. Which testimony is accurate? Morrison's face flushed slightly. I may have been conservative in my written report. You testified that my client became argumentative when you requested his documents. According to your report, did my client provide his license and registration when requested? Yes, but his attitude was suspicious. Officer Morrison is providing requested documents when asked considered resisting arrest. No, but You also testified that my client physically resisted arrest. Can you describe this physical resistance? Morrison shifted in his seat. Tyler had not actually resisted at all, but Morrison had written in his report that there was minor resistance. Now he had to decide how far to stretch the truth. The defendant tensed up when I attempted to handcuff him. Did he strike you? No. Did he attempt to flee? No. Did he raise his voice or make any threatening statements? He questioned my authority, which in my experience often escalates to violence. Christine turned toward the judge. Your Honor, questioning police authority is not a crime, and the officer has admitted that no actual violence occurred. She turned back to Morrison. Officer Morrison, you testified that you couldn't verify the vehicle's ownership. Did you run the license plate through your computer system? This was the question Morrison had been dreading. Yes, I ran the plate. And what did that search reveal? Morrison knew he was trapped. The vehicle was registered to Linda Johnson, at the same address as the defendant's license. So the vehicle was not stolen? Not technically, but there were suspicious circumstances. What suspicious circumstances? That a 16-year-old was driving his mother's car with her permission to pick up his sister from school? Crawford objected, but the damage was done. Morrison's testimony was falling apart, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. Christine continued her questioning, systematically destroying every aspect of Morrison's story. By the time she finished, it was clear that Tyler had done nothing wrong, and that Morrison had arrested him based on assumptions and prejudice rather than evidence. But Morrison was not a man who accepted being made to look foolish, especially not in a courtroom full of people. As Christine walked back to her table feeling confident that the charges against Tyler would be dismissed, Morrison's anger was building to a dangerous level. Judge Williams was reviewing her notes when Morrison suddenly stood up. Your Honor, this is exactly the problem with our justice system today. We coddle these kids and their fancy lawyers, and then we wonder why crime is out of control. Officer Morrison, please sit down, Judge Williams said firmly. But Morrison was beyond listening to reason. His face was red with rage, and years of unchecked authority and prejudice were boiling over. This kid was up to no good, I guarantee it. They come into decent neighborhoods thinking they can do whatever they want. Officer Morrison, I'm warning you. Morrison turned toward Tyler with fury in his eyes. You think you're smart, don't you? You think your slick lawyer and your sob story are going to get you out of this? Tyler shrank back in his chair, terrified by the intensity of Morrison's anger. The officer took a step toward the defendant's table, his hand moving instinctively toward where his service weapon would normally be. Officer Morrison, return to your seat immediately, Judge Williams commanded, her voice echoing through the courtroom. Instead, Morrison lunged toward Tyler. You need to learn some respect. The sound of Morrison's hand striking Tyler's face echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. Tyler's head snapped to the side, and a red mark immediately appeared on his cheek. Gasps and shouts filled the air as spectators jumped to their feet. You people think you can come into our neighborhoods, drive our streets, and act like you belong, Morrison shouted, using language that made several people in the gallery gasp in shock and horror. Christine immediately jumped between Morrison and Tyler, while bailiffs rushed toward the witness stand. Judge Williams was banging her gavel and shouting for order, but the chaos had erupted too quickly to contain. Morrison was reaching for his handcuffs, apparently intending to assault Tyler further, when the double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with such force that they slammed against the walls. The sound made everyone in the room freeze. Through those doors walked a tall, imposing figure in a dark suit, flanked by two other, serious-looking individuals. The man in the center moved with the kind of authority that commanded immediate attention, and the federal credentials hanging from his jacket were visible even from across the room. Morrison's hand stopped mid-reach for his handcuffs. His face, which had been red with rage just moments before, suddenly drained of all color. The angry shouting that had filled the courtroom was replaced by complete, suffocating silence. The man walking down the center aisle had Tyler's eyes and Tyler's determined jawline. And as he approached the front of the courtroom, Morrison realized that the kid he had just assaulted in front of a room full of witnesses was not some random teenager from the wrong side of town. Agent David Johnson, had arrived, and Officer Jake Morrison was about to discover just how wrong he had been about everything. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that the sound of dress shoes on marble floors seemed to echo like thunder. Agent David Johnson moved down the center aisle with the measured pace of someone who had spent years walking into hostile situations and taking control. Behind him, Agents Patricia Reeves and Miguel Santos spread out slightly, their trained eyes scanning the room and assessing potential threats. Officer Morrison stood frozen at the witness stand, his hand still extended toward where Tyler sat. The rage that had consumed him moments before was rapidly being replaced by a cold, creeping fear that started in his stomach and spread through his entire body. Morrison had been a cop long enough to recognize federal authority when he saw it, and everything about the three people who had just entered his courtroom screamed federal law enforcement. Tyler looked up through tears he didn't realize had been forming and felt his world shift completely. His father was supposed to be unreachable, somewhere deep undercover on a case that Tyler wasn't allowed to know the details of. But there he was, walking toward the front of the courtroom like an avenging angel. And Tyler had never been so happy to see anyone in his entire life. Judge Williams had seen enough courtroom drama in her 20 years on the bench to recognize when a situation was about to change completely. The three federal agents approaching her bench moved with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they had worked together for years. She set down her gavel and waited. David Johnson stopped directly in front of Officer Morrison, close, enough that Morrison could see the fury carefully controlled behind the agent's professional demeanor. When David spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the kind of authority that made everyone in the room lean forward to listen. Officer Morrison, I am Special Agent David Johnson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. David's credentials were already in his hand, held at eye level where Morrison couldn't miss them. The young man you just assaulted is my son. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. No sound came out. His brain was trying to process what he was hearing, but the implications were so enormous that his mind seemed to be shutting down. Agent Reeves stepped forward, her voice crisp and professional. Officer Morrison, you are hereby under investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for violation of civil rights, under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Additionally, Agent Santos added, consulting a tablet in his hands, you are under investigation for filing false police reports, assault under color of authority, and violation of the 4th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I was just doing my job. The kid was suspicious. The kid, David interrupted, his voice like ice, is an honor student who was driving his mother's car with permission to pick up his 10-year-old sister from soccer practice. The kid has never been arrested, never been in trouble at school, and according to the registration documents you examined, was exactly where he said he was supposed to be. David took another step closer to Morrison. The kid whose face you just struck in front of a room full of witnesses is my son, and I'm a federal agent who has spent the last 3 months building a case against a drug trafficking organization that your department has been trying to catch for 2 years. Morrison's legs felt weak. He gripped the edge of the witness stand to keep from falling. Judge Williams spoke for the first time since the agents had entered. Agent Johnson, this is highly irregular. I was in the middle of conducting a hearing. David turned toward the judge with respect, but unmistakable authority. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. However, what just occurred in your courtroom was a federal crime committed in full view of multiple witnesses. Officer Morrison's actions constitute assault under color of authority and civil rights violations that fall under federal jurisdiction. Furthermore, Agent Reeves added, our preliminary investigation suggests that this incident is part of a pattern of behavior by Officer Morrison that violates federal civil rights statutes. Morrison suddenly found his courage, or at least his desperation. You can't just walk into my town and start throwing around federal charges. I've been protecting this community for 10 years. Agent Santos looked up from his tablet with the expression of someone who had just heard something particularly amusing. Officer Morrison, In the last 18 months, your department has received 17 complaints about your conduct. 14 of those complaints involved young black males who you arrested on charges that were later dropped or dismissed. Those cases were legitimate. Officer Morrison, David interrupted. 6 months ago, you arrested a 20-year-old college student for loitering outside his own apartment building. 4 months ago, you arrested a high school senior for suspicious behavior while he was waiting for his bus to work. 3 months ago, you arrested a 15-year-old for disorderly conduct because he was wearing a hoodie in a convenience store. Morrison's face was now completely pale. How do you know about those cases? Because, Agent Reeves said with a slight smile. The FBI has been investigating civil rights violations in this jurisdiction for the past year. Your name came up repeatedly in our preliminary research. David pulled out his own tablet and began reading. Yesterday's incident with my son represents the culmination of a pattern of behavior that violates federal law. However, Officer Morrison, what makes your case particularly interesting is what happened after you arrested Tyler. Morrison's eyes darted around the courtroom like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. You see, David continued, when you confiscated those cell phones from the neighbors who were recording your traffic stop, you committed additional federal crimes: obstruction of justice, violation of First Amendment rights, and tampering with evidence. Agent Santos stepped forward. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who witnessed the entire incident, contacted our field office last night. She had already uploaded her recording to cloud storage before you seized her phone. Morrison's face went from pale to gray. That's impossible. I confiscated all the phones. Officer Morrison, Agent Reeves said, it's 2025. Most phones automatically back up videos to cloud storage. Technology has evolved since you last bothered to educate yourself about constitutional policing. Christine Rodriguez, who had been watching this unfold with amazement, finally stood up. Your Honor, in light of these revelations, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. Motion granted, Judge Williams said immediately. All charges against Tyler Johnson are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Tyler felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized was there. 24 hours ago, he had been a regular teenager worried about chemistry tests and soccer practice schedules. Now he was watching federal agents dismantle the case against him while his father stood nearby like a guardian angel in a business suit. Morrison made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Agent Johnson, I'm sure we can work this out. Police officers have to make split-second decisions. Maybe I was a little too aggressive, but I was trying to protect the community. David's expression didn't change. Officer Morrison, you didn't make a split-second decision. You made a series of calculated choices over several hours. You chose to profile my son based on his race. You chose to arrest him despite clear evidence that he had committed no crime. You chose to file false charges. You chose to confiscate evidence. And 30 minutes ago, you chose to assault a minor in a courtroom full of witnesses. Agent Santos consulted his tablet again. Officer Morrison, you are hereby placed under arrest for violation of federal civil rights statutes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the Miranda rights continued, Morrison's legs finally gave out. He slumped into the witness chair, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. His career was over. His pension was gone. And depending on how the federal case went, he might be spending the next several years in federal prison. David finally walked over to Tyler, who stood up on shaky legs. Father and son looked at each other for a moment, years of careful emotional control cracking slightly around the edges. Are you okay? David asked quietly. Tyler nodded, though he was clearly still processing everything that had happened. Dad, how did you know? How did you get here so fast? Your mother called my emergency contact at the bureau last night. I was extracted from my undercover assignment at 3 a.m. David's voice was still controlled, but Tyler could hear the emotion underneath. I got on a plane at 5 a.m. with a team of agents who spent the flight reviewing every case file in your local police department. Linda Johnson, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout the entire confrontation, finally stood up and walked toward her husband and son. The family that had been separated by David's undercover work was finally together again, though none of them could have imagined it would happen under these circumstances. As federal agents led Officer Morrison out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Tyler realized that his nightmare was finally over. But he also understood that his father's arrival meant something much larger was just beginning. Morrison's pattern of behavior was about to be exposed in ways that would change the entire police department. Judge Williams looked around her courtroom, which was slowly returning to normal after the most dramatic hearing of her career. "Court is adjourned," she announced, though it felt somewhat anticlimactic after everything that had just transpired. As the Johnson family walked out of the courthouse together, Tyler couldn't help but think about all the other young people who had been arrested by Morrison over the years. How many of them had fathers who weren't federal agents? How many of them had been convicted of crimes they didn't commit simply because they didn't have the resources to fight back? The answers to those questions would soon become public knowledge, as the FBI's investigation into the police department was about to expand far beyond one corrupt officer. 3 weeks after the courtroom confrontation, Tyler sat in his father's temporary office at the federal building, watching David coordinate what had become one of the largest civil rights investigations in the region's history. The small office was filled with file boxes, computer equipment, and whiteboards covered with names, dates, and connecting lines that looked like a complex spider web. Agent Reeves knocked on the door and entered with a thick folder. "David, we just got the final report from the digital forensics team. Morrison's personal computer contained over 200 deleted emails discussing his arrests with other officers. Some of these conversations are going to shock you." Tyler looked up from his homework. Over the past 3 weeks, he had learned more about police corruption and federal investigations than most people learned in a lifetime. His father had included him in many of the briefings, partly to help Tyler process what had happened to him, and partly because Tyler's testimony would be crucial to the federal case. "How bad is it?" David asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Morrison had a group chat with 5 other officers where they regularly shared photos and jokes about their arrests. They called it cleaning up the neighborhood. Tyler's arrest was actually celebrated in this group chat. Tyler felt his stomach turn. "They were celebrating arresting me?" Agent Reeves nodded grimly. Morrison sent a message saying he had taught another punk a lesson. The responses from the other officers were encouraging him to keep up the good work. David's jaw tightened. How many other officers are we talking about? 7 total, including Morrison. They've been operating as an informal group within the department for over 3 years. Our investigation has identified 47 questionable arrests, 31 dismissed charges, and 12 civil lawsuits that were settled quietly by the city. Tyler set down his pencil. 47 people? There were 47 other people like me? At least 47 that we've found so far, Agent Reeves confirmed. The pattern goes back even further, but the digital evidence only covers the last 3 years. David stood up and walked to one of the whiteboards. "Patricia, I want you to contact every person on this list. We're going to offer them the chance to tell their stories as part of our federal case, and I want victim advocates assigned to help them through the process." Officer Danny Walsh had been the first member of Morrison's group to flip. 2 days after Morrison's arrest, Walsh had walked into the FBI field office with a lawyer and a box of evidence. His conscience had been eating at him since Tyler's arrest, and watching Morrison assault a teenager in open court had finally pushed him past his breaking point. "I knew what Morrison was doing was wrong," Walsh told Agent Santos during his debriefing. "But I was new, and everyone told me that backing up your partner was the most important rule in police work. I was afraid that speaking up would end my career." "Tell us about the group chat," Agent Santos prompted. Walsh pulled out his phone and opened the messaging app. "Morrison started it about 6 months after I joined his unit. At first it seemed like normal police banter, but then it got darker. Morrison would share photos of people he'd arrested, make jokes about their reactions, and encourage the rest of us to be more aggressive in our policing. Agent Santos scrolled through months of messages that revealed a culture of racism, violence, and contempt for the constitutional rights of citizens. The evidence was so overwhelming that even experienced federal investigators were shocked by its scope. Meanwhile, across town at the police station, Chief of Police Robert Martinez was dealing with the worst crisis of his 30-year career. The FBI had seized computers, files, and evidence from 7 officers. The media was camping outside the building, and the phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from lawyers representing Morrison's previous victims. Detective Lisa Chen knocked on the chief's door. "Chief, we've got another problem. 3 more officers just requested lawyers and 2 others have called in sick for the past week." Chief Martinez rubbed his temples. "How many total now?" 14 officers either directly involved in Morrison's group or suspected of knowing about it and staying silent. That's nearly 20% of our patrol division. The chief knew that the department's reputation might never recover from this scandal. But more importantly, he was beginning to realize how many innocent people had been hurt by officers he was supposed to supervise. Tyler's story had become national news within a week of the courtroom incident. Major news networks picked up the story of the FBI agent's son, who had been racially profiled and assaulted by a corrupt police officer. The video from Mrs. Patterson's phone, which showed Morrison's aggressive and unjustified arrest, had been viewed millions of times online. But Tyler wasn't interested in being famous. He was more concerned about the other victims who were starting to come forward. "Dad," Tyler said one evening as they drove home from another FBI briefing, "what's going to happen to all those other people who were arrested by Morrison? Some of them probably spent time in jail for things they didn't do." David had been wondering the same thing. The district attorney's office is reviewing every case involving Morrison and his group. Wrongful convictions will be overturned, and the city will likely face civil lawsuits. Some of these people might be entitled to significant compensation. But what about the ones who couldn't afford lawyers? What about the ones who just pleaded guilty because they didn't think they had any other choice? David looked at his son with pride. Tyler had been through a traumatic experience, but instead of focusing on his own suffering, he was concerned about other victims. "That's exactly why we're doing this investigation, Tyler. We're going to find everyone who was hurt by these officers and make sure they get justice." 6 months later, Tyler stood before a packed auditorium at the community center, preparing to give a speech to local high school students about civil rights and police accountability. The federal investigation had resulted in criminal convictions for Morrison and 3 other officers. 4 additional officers had been fired, and the entire police department was under federal oversight. Morrison himself had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for civil rights violations, assault under color of authority, and obstruction of justice. The judge had noted during sentencing that Morrison's pattern of behavior represented a fundamental betrayal of the oath every police officer takes to protect and serve all members of the community. Tyler had testified at Morrison's trial, describing the fear and confusion he felt during his arrest and the lasting impact of being assaulted in court. His testimony had been powerful, but it was the testimony of Morrison's other victims that truly revealed the scope of the corruption. Jerome Washington, a college student who had been arrested by Morrison for loitering outside his own apartment building, testified about losing his part-time job because of the false arrest. Maria Santos, a high school senior, described how Morrison's aggressive traffic stop had left her afraid to drive alone. And Kevin Thompson, a 15-year-old who had been arrested for wearing a hoodie in a convenience store, talked about how the experience had made him distrust all police officers. The civil lawsuits that followed had cost the city over $12 million in settlements, but more importantly, they had forced the police department to implement comprehensive reforms including body cameras for all officers, bias training, community oversight, and new policies for traffic stops and arrests. Tyler's family had received a substantial settlement from the city, but they had donated most of the money to organizations working on police reform and civil rights advocacy. Tyler had insisted on the donation, saying that his family didn't need the money as much as other victims did. As Tyler began his speech to the high school students, he looked out at an audience that was much more diverse than the neighborhood where he had been arrested. The audience included students from all backgrounds, many of whom had their own stories about encounters with police. 6 months ago, I thought I understood how the world worked, Tyler began. I thought that if you followed the rules, stayed out of trouble, and treated people with respect, you would be treated fairly in return. I learned that the world is more complicated than that. Tyler talked about his arrest, his night in detention, and the courtroom confrontation. But he also talked about the importance of speaking up when you see injustice, the power of community support, and the need for continued reform. The officers who hurt me and dozens of other people are now facing consequences for their actions, Tyler continued. But that's not the end of the story. Real change happens when communities come together to demand better. Real change happens when good police officers speak up about bad police officers. And real change happens when young people like all of you refuse to accept that injustice is just the way things are. In the audience, Officer Danny Walsh sat in civilian clothes, listening to Tyler's speech. Walsh had left the police force after. His testimony helped convict Morrison, but he had enrolled in law school with the goal of becoming a civil rights attorney. Hearing Tyler speak reinforced his decision to dedicate his career to fighting the kind of corruption he had once stayed silent about. After the speech, Tyler was approached by a young girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. "Tyler," she said quietly, "my older brother was arrested by one of those bad police officers 2 years ago. He didn't do anything wrong either, but he was too scared to fight it. Can you help him?" Tyler knelt down to the girl's eye level. "What's your brother's name?" "Anthony. Anthony Martinez." Tyler smiled and pulled out his phone. "I'm going to give you my dad's phone number. Have your brother call him. There are still lawyers working on cases like his, and it's never too late to seek justice." As Tyler walked out of the community center that evening, surrounded by his parents and sister, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that afternoon when he had been driving to pick up Zoe from soccer practice. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also opened his eyes to injustices he had never known existed. Tyler had decided to follow in his father's footsteps and pursue a career in federal law enforcement, but with a focus on civil rights investigations. He wanted to make sure that other young people wouldn't have to go through what he had experienced. Agent David Johnson looked at his son with enormous pride. Tyler had handled himself with maturity and courage throughout the entire ordeal. More importantly, he had chosen to use his experience to help others rather than simply trying to forget what had happened. "You know," David said as they drove home, "when I first joined the FBI, I thought the most important part of the job was catching bad guys. But watching you these past few months has reminded me that the most important part is protecting good people." Tyler nodded. "Dad, do you think what happened to me will make a real difference? Do you think things will actually change?" David considered the question carefully. "Tyler, change is slow and difficult. There will always be people like Morrison who abuse their authority. But there will also always be people like you who refuse to stay silent when they see injustice. As long as there are more people like you than people like Morrison, I believe things will keep getting better." As they pulled into their driveway, Tyler saw his neighbor Mrs. Patterson watering her garden. She waved at them with a big smile. Mrs. Patterson had become something of a local hero for her role in recording Morrison's misconduct and for being the first neighbor to contact the FBI. Tyler waved back, thinking about how many people had played a role in bringing justice to his case. His mother's determination, his father's expertise, his lawyer's skill, Mrs. Patterson's courage, Officer Walsh's conscience, and the testimony of dozens of other victims had all been necessary to expose the corruption and bring about change. It had taken a village to seek justice, and Tyler was proud to be part of that village. As he walked into his house, where Zoe was waiting to hear about his speech, Tyler felt optimistic about the future. There was still work to be done, but he was ready to do it.